Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar for those who've been invited to submit a final application to CLIR's Digitizing Hidden Special Collections and Archives, Amplifying Unheard Voices program this year. I'm Sharon Burney, a program officer of the CLIR Grants team, and today's session will be focused on assessing collections for digitization. We're going to start off with some introductions, first to this platform, and then to our presenter for today's webinar. To start off, we want to share some notes about using Zoom during this session. A live transcript is being generated if you'd like to utilize it. To turn on this feature, click the CC Live Transcript button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Attendees will be muted throughout the presentation. However, you're welcome to use chat for general introductions and conversation. If a chat box isn't already displaying on your Zoom screen, you can hover your mouse toward the bottom of the screen and open it manually. In order to send a message to everyone, remember to change the default from all panelists to all panelists and attendees. We ask that you use the separate Q&A box to ask questions. This can be opened the same way as the chat box. Because we have limited time together, please feel free to follow along with questions as they come in and upvote them to let us know that it would be helpful to you to have them answered live. We'll do our best to answer all of the questions live, but we will also share responses to all questions alongside the recording. The session is being recorded. The slides, Q&A, recording, and transcript will be made available on the Apply for an Award page of our website in the next 2 weeks.
Before we move into our program content, we'd like to center today's conversation by acknowledging that as residents of the U.S., we are speaking to you from unceded land of many Indigenous peoples. We recognize the longstanding history that has brought us to reside on this land, and we seek to have greater understanding of our place within that colonial history. We denounce any acts of terrorism, colonialism, and environmental disregard, both past and present. In particular, we'd like to respectfully acknowledge and recognize the original and current caretakers of the land, water, and air where we live, all Indigenous peoples and all their ancestors and descendants. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on their homelands, and ask you to join me in acknowledging all Indigenous communities. May this acknowledgement and our ongoing work demonstrate CLIR's commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. If you haven't done so already, we'd love for you to introduce yourself in the chat and share a land acknowledgement for the area where you live, if you would like.
During today's session, our hosts will dig into one of the topics we mentioned last week, assessing collections for digitization. We've allotted 90 minutes total for today, and the speaker will pause at the halfway point at 2:45 Eastern Standard Time for a quick break, continue with the presentation, and then move towards Q&A at approximately 3:05 Eastern Standard Time. We're hoping for an engaging time of conversation around identifying and clarifying the collections and materials that will be nominated for digitization, accurately estimating volume of materials and digitization outputs, making a competitive case for digitization. The plan is to reserve about 25 minutes for Q&A near the end of this session. Both the session co-hosts and CLIR staff will be available to answer questions at that time. So while you may pose questions throughout using the Q&A box, keep in mind that we may not get to every question as it's asked. Staff will be keeping track and will circle back to unanswered questions during the dedicated Q&A. We want to start with a quick poll to gauge how you're feeling about today's topic of assessing collections for digitization. In today's session, you'll learn more about the skills and strategies you'll need to complete the following application tasks. Project details material task, which includes the list of collections, upload, and the representative samples upload, and tell the story task. And our poll has been launched.
So it looks like we have responses from just about everyone. I'll give you guys a few more seconds before we go back to the share. Okay. Now we're glad to turn things over to Dr. Mitch Fraas, Senior Curator for Special Collections at the Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books and Manuscripts at the University of Pennsylvania Libraries. We'll take just a moment to let Mitch share their slides and get oriented, and as they do that, please remember that we'll be breaking for 5 minutes at the halfway point. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Just going to share my slides here. There we go. Thanks so much to the CLIR staff and everyone for inviting me and for bringing me into contact with all the applicants here today. It's really a privilege and a pleasure to talk to you about some of the issues around selecting and coming up with a cohesive argument over collections to digitize as part of the Hidden Collections project. I'm probably a bit biased, but I think the CLIR Hidden Collections grant program, which has existed in various manifestations for over a decade now, is pretty much one of the best things to happen in the field of cultural heritage and digitization. Anyone looking to highlight and engage with their holdings, this is just a godsend. And it's especially exciting to see how the program has really honed its focus in recent years on amplifying unheard voices. You heard a little bit of my background there. I'm Senior Curator and Director of Special Collections and Research Services here at Kislak Center at Penn. I've been the PI or Penn lead on 2 successful Hidden Collections CLIR grants in the past. And I'll put links in the chat right here just so you can see that. And I've also been really privileged to be a participant on several other CLIR grants, including some done in collaboration with other institutions here in the area. And it's really been an amazing privilege to work on these. The 2 that I've been primarily working on are Manuscripts of the Muslim World and The Health of the New Nation, both big collaborative grants, largely out of Philadelphia, and which produced, I think, very different outputs. One focused on a lot of early modern and pre-modern manuscripts, and the other on a lot of archival and 19th century material. I've also worked on, not as a lead, but in sort of consulting roles on a large digitization project here at Penn around Marian Anderson's papers, and helped out on a couple of other grants, including one to digitize records from some of Philadelphia's houses of worship. So it's the CLIR Hidden Collections project has played a big role in my history as a librarian here at Penn. Also, should give a shout out to CLIR for starting me on my librarian journey. I was a CLIR postdoc back in 2011, which was my first full-time library job. So can't say enough good things about CLIR. My own academic background is in the history of South Asia, but in the past decade, I've really enjoyed working on collections here, ranging from medieval manuscripts to the Afrofuturist Sun Ra. And I imagine all of you here today have a similarly broad range of interests across different time periods and subjects and institutions. I should say I'm acutely aware that I'm coming from a relatively well-resourced, university library setting, which is different than I think a lot of applicants might be coming from. And I think that can result in some significant blind spots or biases in how we talk about selecting material, or even in the digitization process itself. And I'm sort of hopeful that my remarks won't be too predicated on any particular resource dependency, but please do in the Q&A if there are questions about how to do things in different sort of institutional or resource environments. I think that would be very helpful. I have, though, in the past on CLIR grants, worked with a variety of institutions ranging from large but not well-resourced historical societies to small colleges, private organizations, to individual houses of worship who just happen to have records in their basement. So it I've sort of seen the gamut of different kinds of digitization structures. So this is something that I think we can maybe talk about more in the Q&A if you have particular concerns about scale and scope. I'm going to be talking today about assessing collections for digitization and in a couple of key areas. First, telling the story of the materials you want to digitize, listing the materials that you're proposing, the formats and amounts to be digitized, and also estimating outputs and amounts. And then the sort of representative samples you'd be submitting. I'm taking this outline from the general CLIR application which you'll have seen, and these are sort of some of the main areas from that CLIR application that you'll be expected to complete, and it makes a decent framework to talking about some of these materials. There's a lot to cover, and I know I'll probably be leaving some things out, so please do bring things up in the chat or in the Q&A as they do. So I imagine everyone who's at this point in the CLIR process, you've done the sort of pre-application, you're at this point of putting together the big package, and you're probably thinking about and wading into the many pages of technical details, budgets, lists, and other documents, which can, I think, at least to me, when I was doing it, seem sort of overwhelming. But often I would sort of lose sight of the core part of the grant, which is really any grant, which is the story that you're telling of like, why are we even doing this before you get to the lists of files and, letters of support and all that. And I think that story and the way materials support it is at the heart of this, and it makes a good application and one that is going to be a successful project. And it's not just a story you're telling to the reviewers of the grant in order to get the grant, but a story you're telling to yourself as the applicant, and then the communities that you are serving. So this sort of narrative of why it is we're doing this, and why this particular material. And I was going to share, I think, one thing from one of our successful applications in just a second, which I think helps show a little about how you can narrativize this. One, I think, important point here is just cribbed from CLIR itself, but I think important for the Amplifying Hidden Voices particular focus of these grant programs is always remembering the public knowledge, community-centered access, broad representation, authentic partnerships, and sustainable infrastructures that CLIR is looking for coming out of these grant projects. And I'm trying to think about as you're writing your statement of why this material and why now, trying to answer each of those questions in both the broad sense and then in the particular sense of not just, is this a good idea generally, but why this certain number of boxes or this set of materials, what exactly is this going to contribute, and sort of reminding yourself, how does what I'm choosing here to digitize help meet each of these goals? I have cribbed this from one of our projects. A colleague of mine and several others did a major hidden collections grant with our Marian Anderson collection here. We have probably over 500 boxes of her papers, including recordings, everything you can possibly imagine. And we wanted to apply for a grant to make this more available to the public. And I particularly like this statement and the simplicity of the justification that I've put on the screen here. I should say I did not write this. I think my colleagues here have distilled a highly complex set of collection materials. It's over 500 boxes, huge range of stuff, different formats, and they've distilled that around a particular figure, say Marian Anderson, into really three concise points. We're going to digitize broadly these things. We're going to digitize her private sound recordings, her audio interviews and transcripts, her recital programs, more than three things, diaries and notebooks and scrapbooks. Like, of all this massive stuff, 500 plus boxes, like these are the things we're going to do from this figure. And here's why. I've just put that in yellow. I think I like that formulation. Now that they're digitized, these materials will allow X group of people, a community, a whoever, in this case, we were saying, you know, academic researchers, you know, digitizing these things will allow X group of people to do Y. You know, what will having these online and either available to the public or available to a smaller set of people, you know, what are you really trying to achieve? You know, this is not just about, you know, I think it would not be a, you know, this is, I was thinking back to some of the big microfilming projects of the 70s where the justification was, well, you know, we'll get every issue of, you know, the Philadelphia Inquirer on microfilm. Like, that's the justification. You want every single one of them. That's enough. That's all you need to know. I don't know who's going to use it, but we got to do it. In this case, I think there's a lot sharper a focus, and that, you know, making a clear justification for what having, you know, a particular set of materials online is going to do for whoever you identify as a community. And I think in this case, you know, we highlight academic researchers for the CLIR grant. I think there are so many different communities that could be the possible audience here, that thinking through and then highlighting specifically for the reviewers, who is it you're focused on as your audience. I have, you know, thinking through how you select. This is something I'll be covering at length, but just to sort of dive in, I wanted to highlight the importance of thinking through, you know, once you've sort of conceptualized, okay, we've got Marian Anderson, a really important historical figure for a lot of reasons. We've got 500 boxes of stuff. We have sort of a vague idea of categories, you know, how are we going to proceed from here? And I think this is an exercise that is very helpful, and one that I'll talk about sort of in terms of community engagement. But on the bottom left there, you can see one set of boxes from her collection, and the upper right, a different set of boxes. You know, it's a huge amount of material. And the bottom left is boxes of awards she received. She received hundreds of awards over the course of her lifetime. You know, these are little like statuettes or little plaques or little wooden things, tons of them. And the upper right is a listing from our sort of inventory or finding aid of the collection of her personal notebooks, journals, diaries, and other writings. And I'm sort of setting up probably a false dichotomy here, but in this case, it was easy for us to look at 500 boxes and say, okay, we've only got a certain capacity in the CLIR grant. You know, it's not millions of dollars. We want to focus on things that are going to have the highest research impact. That was research and classroom impact were some of our big deliverables. And then as a third, you know, the arts community and the Philadelphia community writ large. And we thought, you know, if you go through this big list of what we have, it's so clear to us that her diaries, notebooks, and journals created by her in her own handwriting, detailing her life are a must-have. These are sources that were only available in the reading room before that, which we could make available to a wide audience. And equally clear, I think, was the argument that taking pictures with a camera of a bunch of awards was not a great use of our resources for the particular audience we were dealing with. That, you know, proposing to CLIR, you know, we're going to do this big Marian Anderson digitization project, and, you know, we're going to start with the awards. That's what we're going to do. I think would be not a very compelling kind of application. It would be hard to explain how these awards would, you know, pictures of the awards from even 2 angles or something would contribute to, you know, greater public knowledge and engagement with the life of this great musical artist. This is not to say that we couldn't construct an argument for why, for a different community or a different purpose, and say, you know, we think that 3D modeling of these awards serves some purpose in mapping out, you know, sort of respectability politics of, you know, who's getting what award. I think there's some arguments to be made there, but, you know, we made a choice. I think all of the applicants here are having to make tough choices about what you want to do and for what audience. And we chose to pick out, you know, the primary sort of manuscript writing material she did, her personal recordings, and the sort of programs and ephemeral records of her different performances. So we took 500 boxes of stuff and distilled it into a much smaller amount of things, and created a sort of argument around why this would contribute to our particular community of researchers, increase in engagement with the material, and certainly by default access through making this available online. The next thing I have here is the importance of access and engagement and making an argument for your selections, and really how difficult selection can be sometimes. And it's not always as self-evident as someone like Marian Anderson, where you're presented with, in our case, 500 boxes of pretty well-described stuff. And you're just choosing like what is the best, most important for our audience. Sometimes, and I'm using a case from the Manuscripts of the Muslim World grant we did, you're really thinking about just the raw goal of increasing access to a given set of materials and making sure not just that these materials are available, but that these are of cultural importance to a particular community and that they are being described and made available in an accurate and respectful way. And that in itself, I think, can go a long way to making an argument for access. I have an example here. On the left and sort of bottom right are what the descriptions of some of our Islamic manuscripts here at Penn looked like before the CLIR grant. I think, I don't know if it needs saying, but I should say that describing a manuscript Quran as being held in a, quote, beige shoebox, or that a copy of Al-Jazuli's compilation of prayers would bear the outdated and often offensive description of Muhammadan Book of Prayers on its front there in gilt. Pretty easy to argue that this is not a way that people are going to engage with this material. This is not providing, respectful and accurate representation of these materials. They're certainly hidden in that they're, described only in paper and not digital. But even if these were sort of electronic records, they would be equally, I think, hidden. And we wanted to, in this case, sort of transform these manuscripts from sort of like curios in the collection of a large university to something that was engaging with a community of scholars. And I think it really helped us make a justification for how intervention through digitization and cataloging would be a really worthwhile goal for CLIR to fund. You'll see the end result of the grant is the sort of tiny text there in the bluish box is what our catalog records look now, with Arabic script, thorough description, and proper terms that are findable. Many of these now, I was just looking at our stats today, viewed 12 or 16,000 times since they went up in 2021, I think. So, an amount of engagement, logarithmically more than they were getting in the beige shoebox. On that point, I wanted to talk about consultation and selection and, really the role that plays. I put up here from the Manuscripts of the Muslim World grant, just a selection of the people we worked with in developing the project. I think everyone knows, most successful grants won't involve just like the person who's applying or the curator, whoever, or the person who had the idea, sort of their off the top of the head notion of like, yeah, let's digitize this. Like, I just feel like it. Almost all of these projects require consultation and careful thought to determine, even if the idea is originally the work of one person, the actual selecting of materials, the nitty gritty, figuring out what to include, what not to include, is, I think, best done by a large group of people in consultation. I should say, in that Marian Anderson's awards example, I can imagine, if we were not considering a research audience, having an audience of singers and people involved in Philadelphia arts who might have had a very, different idea of what was in and what was out. I think there'd be a lot of overlap, but I think thinking through who you'd like to serve with this grant helps determine that. Also getting a array of people with different, disciplinary interests, ranging in sort of career phases as well. Some of our most active participants in sort of conceptualizing the grant and figuring out material were graduate students who had a lot of enthusiasm and new ideas. To give an example of what came out of this consultative project, we knew we wanted to digitize, this is the sort of idea, was we'll digitize all of the Islamic manuscripts in Philadelphia and maybe New York. After talking with a lot of people, we really refined the scope and expanded it to be not just manuscripts with Islamic content or religious manuscripts, but rather from Islamic cultures broadly. So there was a big request from the people we were talking with for Christian Coptic manuscripts from Egypt, Hindu materials written in Persian in South Asia, Likewise, we were able to include materials in Arabic from the Caribbean, from enslaved people in the 18th century, and talking with our sort of constituents of researchers and scholars really helped us make the case for why our scope of like these manuscripts, not those manuscripts, would make sense. And it was nice to be able to say, we can back this up with, direct conversations with people in the field. This is not to say, I think, to try to combat the bias of just academic study, which was certainly one of the main purposes of this particular grant I worked on. Through the course of this, we realized and saw that different audiences in a different kind of grant might have had very different justifications and talked to very different people. Kudos to the Free Library of Philadelphia, who was one of our partners, who decided a year or so into the grant to consult and talk with local Philadelphia mosques and members of the Muslim community in Philadelphia about what they would like to see from these now digitized objects. And, I can imagine if that was our aim from the beginning, maybe a focus on more devotional manuscripts, a focus on transcription, I can imagine us having an argument-driven grant proposal in a slightly different direction. So I think both of those are equally valid, and especially in the Amplifying Hidden Voices grant application, and the criteria that CLIR sets forth, being very clear about who you've consulted and what kind of audience you're imagining, I think makes a huge difference in how this will be read and how the community also will receive it. Is this primarily something we've talked only with tenured professors about and what they really want to do, or is it something with a different kind of audience and that you've taken into consideration when selecting which things are in and which things are out? I think in our case, classroom use in academic study was perfectly justifiable sort of audience and goal, but I think that is one of very many possible outcomes of these grants. And I think the more creative and consultative you can get with how you're picking materials, the better. So formats, amounts to be digitized, some of the getting into more of the particular questions. How do you do this work of selection? It's one thing to sort of talk with your constituents. In the case of the manuscripts of the Muslim world, we had sort of a little get-together symposium beforehand, before we wrote things up to talk about things. But largely, that's at sort of a high level. So you've decided we're going to do everything from Egypt, regardless of religious background. Good, all very good. But how do you actually do the selection of the actual things, coming up with the amounts to digitize, the outcomes, the tough questions about, we've got 50 manuscripts and money to do 40 of them. So this is, I think, the sort of meaty problem, given that many of you already have identified a sort of core set or have some idea of a set of resources, how you begin to drill down on that. I've taken a snippet here from the CLIR application on the left, which I think, kudos to the CLIR staff, really, really well written and very, very clear. Should remove that. Very evident. And I think these are really the things that you should be asking yourself throughout the process of doing this selection, and then the actual picking of material. It's all well and good to have the sort of highfalutin ideas about a big concept, but identifying the actual material formats of things, their history of their place in your institution, where in the world they're from, what date they're from, what kind of conditions they're in, their storage, and just the sheer, how many things. You'd be surprised how many times, especially this is true in libraries, discussions at the high level get derailed when it comes time to be like, okay, so how many of these VHS cassettes do we have? And you're like, well, I don't know, a lot. This is the time to actually make those decisions and come up with a number. So this is always my temptation when people ask, so you're interested in the X collection or whatever. How big is it? What do you want to digitize? Yeah, 12 boxes. It's 12 boxes. That's what we want to do. We want to digitize those 12 boxes of the collection. Sadly, that doesn't really work most of the time. there's nothing quite as scary as especially in my case, a donor saying, I've got 50 boxes from the Community Action League. You don't even need, it's just a lot of different material. It's all great. It's good. You like never know what's in there. And for the purposes of making a really strong application with a coherent narrative and justification, this is where getting into the like, what is it that we're actually digitizing? And the answer is not boxes. Each of these boxes obviously holds all manner of surprises. And I think oftentimes one of the hard parts of doing these applications is actually the hands dirty sifting through things to see like what's in there and realizing that the inventory from 1999 taped to the front of the box is completely wrong and you've got to rethink everything. So, you know, actually having an opportunity to go through, look at some general categories of material and begin sorting, aggregating them in your head of like, okay, you know, we've got these things which we want to work with, these things which I think are a second priority, and then these other things I don't think we make sense to apply for. You know, what's in those boxes? I think if we had a show of hands, whoops, wrong slide. If we had a show of hands, there we go. A lot of you would say you've got printed material of some sort in what you're applying to digitize newspapers, magazines, printed books, which is sort of the bread and butter of digitization projects since the beginning of digitization. And this is something that we have always struggled with where I am of prioritizing and figuring out how to balance sort of unique material against important material in context. What do I mean by that? I would say it is, using an example from the Marian Anderson papers here, it would not be a compelling, I'm speaking for CLIR. CLIR should in the chat just be like, this guy is crazy. I don't think it would be a very compelling application to say, you know, Marian Anderson was mentioned in the New York Times 800 times during her career. As a result, we want to digitize the New York Times from 1940 to 1960. I think it is not controversial to say that's not a very compelling vision for digitization. The New York Times, well represented online, albeit for a fee, so you could make an argument about public access, some rights issues there, but you know, it's not a unique resource. It's a widely known thing. It's got enormous digitization coverage. And to find 800 articles on Marian Anderson by digitizing 50,000 papers is not a very, you know, you get the point, a good use of resources. On the other hand, in our case, you know, we have a couple scrapbooks of newspaper clippings covering her career from all manner of magazines, newspapers, et cetera. And we sort of waffled on this of like, yes, you could actually search the New York Times database online and find many of these. Even the Afro-American there is covered in some online databases. But despite that, we think that her scrapbooking practices and the ability of researchers to see all those clippings in one place by flipping through the scrapbooks made a very strong case for why we should digitize it and not say, you know, this content isn't unique. This clipping from the Afro-American there is not unique. Many research libraries and public libraries across the country have copies of the Afro-American and will have that exact thing, but they won't have it readily clipped out and, you know, available in the sort of context that we do. So I would say the same, in my opinion, applies to a lot of different printed material, making tough decisions on, you know, is this printed material unique and part of the argument or, you know, amplifying that I'm trying to do here? And if not, if it is from sort of mass media that's well represented, is it though part of some sort of compilation or practice that makes it particularly interesting or useful to your target community to have all in one place or accessible, and think through that way, especially in a world like this one where between printed books, newspapers and magazines, the extant coverage online is remarkably rich. There's huge mass digitization of these three categories, and some careful thinking about uniqueness and non-duplication is probably helpful. You'd be surprised how often, you know, even happens here, people will say like, oh, you know, we should really digitize this Philadelphia journal or magazine. You know, it's like published by a Penn Department of Chemistry. Like, who's going to have that? And you're like, oh, wait, University of Michigan already did it. Great, wow. So, figuring out some of these priorities can help in the printed realm. I think this next section here, unpublished manuscript, TypeScript material, also a bread and butter of past CLIR grants, is what many of you probably will be proposing to digitize. And this is often unique material already, so you don't have that sort of trade-off. It's just sort of self-evidently the only access to this is going to be through your images often. So it has that sort of case checked off. But I think in selection here, I've seen internally, at least when we do our own digitization, people get tripped up around trying to figure out viable, I'd say granularity, or like, what is the user really going to see here? To give an example, if you're proposing to digitize this kind of material from your city's parks department, displaying to users 1,000 digitized pages of financial minutes could be useful. But think of that against something that's like, described as memo on the costs of changing signage at the former Robert E. Lee Park, 2 pages, 1983. Like that level of granularity obviously does a different amount of work than dumping 1,000 pages of financial minutes into one big PDF or something, into one big bucket, let's put it that way. Other times, you could make a convincing case that, the volume is what really is going to drive engagement and research, that having all of the financial minutes of your particular city's finance department is an incredible, window on a particular research area or kind of civic engagement, even though it'll be available at sort of a broad level, like, financial minutes 1978, not hugely searchable. But despite that, that this would be providing, an incredible level of availability for citizen journalists or others, or, I could see arguments being made there. And oftentimes, if you don't have the level of description at that granularity, there's a lot of cases to be made to put things online at the best you can do, really. But I think in selecting, if you have options, it's not always the case, but if you have options in these kinds of materials, choosing based on your audience what kinds of levels of granularity to digitize as, because you're not going to have, it's as sort of self-intuitive as, people will sort of, going back to this, sort of silly New York Times example, there's sort of an intuitive browsing of that. People understand the logic of newspapers to have a given year and a month and a page, it's browsable. 1,000 pages of financial minutes often do not have any of that inherent browsability. Similarly, I think many of you probably will be proposing some amount of digitization of photographs, slides, and negatives. I should say I could have lumped photographs, newspapers, manuscripts all together in some ways, because I think the format, the resulting digital file that at the end of the day will look pretty similar. I think, in terms of technical standards, most people digitizing manuscripts or a photograph are going to output a TIFF file that is largish, and then maybe derivative files for people to view on their website. Go either way. And so in a way, the original format then is just sort of transferred to one big image file. And I think these are very understandable. You've got one photograph, you output a TIFF file. This is a little less complicated than some of the other media formats. In the case of photographs, negatives, slides, all that stuff, though, I think there's a separate kind of danger, which is sort of the shock and awe problem of large photographic collections. I was thinking of some of ours here, and it can seem super appealing. I was thinking of some of our more obscure ones. The incredible, 17,000 photos of historic cat figurines does a certain kind of work. You just got so many photos accessible to the public for the first time. You want a cat figurine photo, you've got it. Truly comprehensive. All of that is going in the application. But thinking of that, like how does that help your argument and your narrative for why you're doing this project in a way versus, say, digitizing 100 photographs of individually described members of like the plaintiffs and lawyers in a landmark chemical pollution suit from 1987, where you've got lots of good detail on the people in the photos. It's not a huge number, but you're actually able to say something about them. Again, I see arguments for both the 17,000 cat photos and the 100 highly specific photos, but with very different use cases and different sort of perhaps community feedback on why you would or would not want that kind of comprehensiveness or not. Also, something to think about with this kind of media, I was just having a conversation the other day when our digitization studio outputted entirely negative TIFF images, which is correct. They're taking pictures of negatives through a special machine. Very hard for users to engage with negative images. It is very easy to flip them to positive image, and folks and photographers will say it's subjective. When you're making positive images, there's lots of choices involved. I think that's fair. But in terms of researcher access, I feel like browsing positive images so much easier than negative images. Likewise, thinking with your community about if you've got contact sheets versus individual photos, are there arguments to be made for getting to do more digitization of contact sheets sort of raw by the end versus the sort of high resolution on the particular. Again, depends on what you're trying to depict and what kind of impact you're looking to make for whatever community you're digitizing for. In our case, recently we decided to do contact sheets over individual photographs because we imagined the main use case was browsing and seeing a broad range of somewhat similar photographers' photos rather than scrolling through individual 10,000 photos. I think can make those arguments. Tapes, cassettes, discs, media obviously output different file formats, and in many cases these can be quite large. I'll talk about that in a little bit. One thing I should say here, I know there's going to be other sessions dealing with rights, but with all of these categories, especially audio though, and video, thinking through rights implications. Obviously, there's a session on this because you could talk for hours, is important. I'd also add that captioning and accessibility here for audio and video is something that you really would want to think about why you're taking a particular stance. If you're saying, we're going to send these out to a vendor and receive audio files back, and we're going to put them online raw, and here's why: for resource reasons, for main audience reasons. These are musical and abstract and don't have words. What are the reasons you're making choices around to provide captioning or not? Also thinking through risks on recoverability. This is a photo of a disc that we sent off and paid a lot of money to find out that it is irretrievable. It's delaminated, and it actually looks really good in this photo. It does not look good in real life. And I think, before proposing to digitize, 100 oral history discs that have never been listened to, and finding out later that they're unusable, doing a quick sample with a vendor, someone knowledgeable, to make sure that at least some of these are viable is really important before making a major grant commitment to something. And also to understand some of the complications there. Sampling can be fantastic way to feel better about embarking on one of these large media projects. I think before our break, I'll make a note on granularity. I've sort of touched on this. I see this making a big difference in the way different grants make different arguments for why you're selecting particular material. And I wanted to think about how your argument or your story for why digitize this versus that changes between, say, digitizing all of boxes 1 to 20 of manuscript material from the papers of the Society for Owl Studies, I don't know, versus digitizing a selection of single elaborate amuletic manuscripts like the one on the left there, owned by people in Owl Studies. I don't know. They say different things. They serve different audiences, and they will have very different engagement. That individual amulet there, it's actually about this big. It's going to see a lot of individual use, probably used outside the context. This is from the manuscripts of the Muslim World Project. based on our download, like probably most used outside of that context. So if someone is not looking at all of our manuscripts, they're going and looking at this one manuscript in particular. Whereas with those boxes of OWL studies, which is made up, I don't know why I just chose that, you can imagine that most researchers or interested parties working on that are going to look at more than one thing in there. You know, they're in it for the owls. They're going to start browsing through that collection and really using all different pieces of it. You know, and as you make decisions about, you know, how much of a coherent collection you're digitizing versus how much of individual things, I think taking into account that use case is super important, and thinking through what you gain and lose in terms of access, engagement, community responsibility as you choose discrete objects versus comprehensive wholes. So with that, we will break briefly to catch your breath, and then I'll finish off with some thoughts about estimation and representative samples.
We'll take a quick 5-minute break and we'll see you back at 2:50.
Whenever you're ready, Mitch.
Oh, thanks so much. Right, hope everyone is rested. And thanks for joining on an afternoon. I know a lot of us are in Zoom a lot, so it's always humbling when people choose to hear you on Zoom. You know, I'm transitioning here to the sort of really nitty-gritty stuff through the lens of, I think, I'm going to talk about some of these like CLIR templates in a second, but one of the things that I found helpful to sort materials in my mind, at least, of how we wanted to make an argument around them. And a big thing in my mind is sort of authorship and origin of materials and making a case around them. Here on the left and right are items from the Marian Anderson papers here. And they're from the same collection. They're not in the same box, but they're in the same milieu. They're two very fascinating documents. One is a photo of Anderson with LBJ and Lady Bird Johnson there at the White House, taken by the White House photographer. And the one on the left is a page from Anderson's journal when she was in South Korea. These are both important historic documents. They have very different origins. And I think that helps me make some decisions. On the left is something that she created herself. She wrote that in her own hand, and she kept it with her journals and diaries over her whole life. The White House photograph we know less about. It's not a photograph she took, obviously, she's in it, taken by a professional photographer. It is in her collection with other materials and photographs of her. She almost certainly had this in fact, we sort of know it was in her possession, but we know less about, you know, where it fits into her thinking. So for a lot of reasons, you'll have the whole right session. By the way, White House photographers really jealous about copyright. You'd think they'd be products of the federal government. It's complicated. But in any event, when you have these different kinds of authorships, we decided in our CLIR grant around Anderson to really focus on things she herself created. We've separately digitized photographs of her. It's really a different project, but also very worthwhile. But in our particular one, we wanted to make a case around doing her own writings, her own recordings of herself that she did at home. And it helped sort of focus in our mind, like, you know, what we wanted to do and why it would matter, that this isn't just anything in the world about her or of her. It also had more or less a single authorship, and since Penn has rights to Anderson's intellectual property, it made it a lot easier also. So two nice things there. So I think if it helps ever to sort material, at least intellectually, by some of these criteria, I found it helpful in selecting. and now listing. One of the big, I think, disconnects often between cultural heritage institutions and researchers or community members is, I think we rightly, I'm going to assert that, have a kind of obsession with format, and you'll see that in the CLIR application as well. You're asked to list, what format are these things? What kind of files are you producing? Even I was thinking our Marian Anderson site, this is the old one, broke everything up by format. You've got your scrapbooks, your notebooks and diaries, your programs, your photographs, your recordings, your interview transcripts. They're separate, right? They're different things. They had to go to different digitization studios, some of these. They're different file types for the recordings. There's different kinds of descriptive metadata for a photograph versus a scrapbook. Like, this makes a lot of library sense. I think I've been convinced that it does not always make sense for researchers, members of the community, people at large, who might be interested in, Marian Anderson and religious education through song. That has nothing to do with format. It could be in her scrapbooks, could be in her recordings, could be in program. It's everywhere. And I think this is where hard decisions about how you organize your work, are sometimes trade-offs that. Having to be granular about media type and format is important for a lot of technical reasons, but how can you mitigate that risk of sort of separating out everything into its own bucket? I don't have any great answers except to provide enough context and explanation and user engagement that people know that they can peruse or engage with a collection beyond just particular format niches. Sort of a soapbox there, but thinking ahead to the nitty gritty, this is a scary slide. I'm sorry. This is the CLIR template. I remember filling this out. It's actually not that many fields, but I found it really useful to look at before attempting my rough drafts of listing, because even knowing I would have to answer these questions affected what I was sort of selecting. Knowing that you're going to have to say something about the rights holder, knowing that you're going to have to say material types, current storage conditions, definitely influenced my thinking of oh, wait, actually, let's not do the Marian Anderson cassettes that are in that box marked moldy. Not a true story. No moldy cassettes, but it does happen with other collections. So I even though it's sort of dry, the template I think is super interesting to begin to consider, and thinking of the nitty gritty now rather than later matters a lot. And I'll give you an example of why. So this is too small, but this is the actual template I filled out for our contribution to Health of a New Nation. It's probably not very readable. I wanted to point out one thing that should stand out like a sore thumb, and kind of did to me then, and I would do things differently now. The very last line there, you see on overall collection size, it's 3 or 4 columns over. We've got things like really well granularly described, like John Briscoe medical notes, 200 images, Trevor medical notes, 200 images, lecture notes of physics, 2,500, we got individual description, great. The very last line, what is that? Overall collection size, 22,300 images. What are those? Penn Medical School theses, 1805 to 1828. That's not like the other stuff. In this case, this was part of a very large project. We made a very convincing case in our narrative, but in hindsight, not getting better control of this last category, that giant, we hold all, Penn was the first medical school in the country, and until 1860s, 1870s, all MDs had to write a thesis or dissertation. And we decided to digitize all of them up to 1828 in many volumes, all handwritten. And it should have been a wake-up call seeing that number compared to these, that I needed to do a little bit more work. There's me with the medical dissertations and those black bindings there. And what I did was I went through, and there were 44 volumes of those pre-1828 medical theses. 44 volumes, great. I took a look at a couple of them and said, these are about 500 pages each. I'm not going to look at all 44. I'm just going to extrapolate and multiply 44 by 500, and I got that 22,000 number. I don't know where the 300 is. But I thought that was perfectly reasonable. I think this is a perfectly fair way of estimating, especially smaller size. If it was a run of 10 volumes or 15 volumes or 20 volumes, doing this kind of brute force sampling and multiplication, I think is totally justifiable. I'm going to talk in a second about margins of error and why things may or may not be more or less justifiable. In this case, I also felt good because I knew even if I was off by some, that we had in-house digitization capacity, even if we didn't have funding, if I screwed up by a little. So I felt better about this than spending a lot of time individually counting leaves of like 44 volumes of medical theses. I should say another key consideration here that makes an enormous difference. I was like, I don't know if I should even mention this, maybe it's too obvious, but different places, and I think both are justifiable, have attitudes to blank pages. The medical theses are written entirely on single sides of paper, with maybe a couple exceptions. But as a policy here, our library is a very particular thing. One of our academic focuses is the history of the book. We've done digitization since the late 90s, and our policy has always been, we do not change the physical object. So it means taking pictures of the entire physical object, regardless of whether there is text. So we take pictures of the binding, the spine, the front, the back, and every single blank page. So that doubles, if you think about scale here, doubles the number of pages, doubles the cost in that way, which internally for us was justifiable because we have a universal policy that applies to every single thing we do. So scholars know that anything we digitize meets these standards. They don't have to guess, like, was the back of this not blank? Did they forget to shoot it? I think in other instances and for other purposes at other institutions, not shooting blank pages can be a fantastic idea and a way to not boost your costs to the stratosphere. Same thing with other kinds of questions around blanks, whether that be blank sides of audio cassettes, whatever it is. I think that's a considered justifiable thing that you can make sort of a call on your own. In this case, we also didn't know, to be fair, since no one had looked at all 44 volumes, we were not confident there wasn't stuff written on the backs of pages. It happened occasionally, but I think it was not very common. So what happened here? And what about errors? So, whoops. I estimated 22,000 dissertation pages. The final report to CLIR recorded that we shot 49,863 images from those dissertations, which is more than double. A couple of reasons. It turned out to be more volumes uncataloged that I didn't know about, so that's fair. But the biggest difference was that the average of the volumes clocked at 831 pages by the time we got through all of them. So the volumes I had looked at were short of representative. The good news on this is twofold, I think. One, in our particular case, we had capacity in the grant as different institutions that were partners did more or less, and pandemic also played into this. So we were able to do all of it for various reasons. Thanks, CLIR. The other reason is that in this case, I knew ahead of time that the margin of error here would be okay, even if way off. Like this is not a good margin of error. I'm not really proud of this. But I knew, given our digitization capacity here and that we were doing it in-house and we were internally charging, that even a factor of 2 would be okay. I knew that going into this, that we could cover probably and have the capacity probably for a pretty big margin of error. And so I in retrospect, my sampling was not good, but I still think defensible in terms of knowing that it would not truly break the bank. I think if you've got if you're sending stuff out to a vendor, having much tighter sampling and knowing that your margin of error cannot be this big is really important. I have the audio cassette example there of how much estimations can change based on number of minutes on the audio tape. So knowing kind of where you stand with this, if you're going to have any wiggle room of more or less costs, I think makes a big difference. And a contingency plan if you start to run into big discrepancies in amounts of material halfway through. In our case, we thought about it once we hit the 22,000, we had to decide, do we keep going? And for various reasons, including the pandemic, internal capacity, changes in funding models, we decided to go for it. But our contingency plan would have been to choose a different cutoff year, because the volumes were arranged in a certain way. So it would not have been a disaster to say we digitized all of the volumes up to 1824 instead of 1828. So, you know, that's intellectually defensible. It's not great from a consistency standpoint of doing what you said you would do, but it at least makes a lot of sense. It doesn't stand out as clearly wrong, and helps with the estimation. I think if I had a super tight budget capacity and digitization capacity, I would have sampled 3 or 4 times as many. So maybe sampling as many as a quarter of the items, just to begin to realize that the page counts were much. I'm trying to think of that 500 versus 800, like a pretty significant range above what I thought they were. This is not a proud story. I hope this doesn't go in the CLIR report about delinquent former applications, but it was very instructive to everyone involved, including our budget office. But also an instructive point here that, at least at Penn, when we do audio cassette digitization, we send it out to a vendor and we have to pay an actual money versus internal capacity. I have a photo there of one of our great camera operators who are on salary. So we know we have a margin of error there because we're sort of charging ourselves. So this is important institutional considerations. I'm running low on time, so I'm going to skip ahead to the representative samples part. This is always a fun part of the application for me. Once you've done the work of doing some estimation and selection from what you want to do and making your argument, getting to show that in a couple really key ways. This is where you don't have to show why all 1,000 pages of those financial reports are really going to enhance access for communities, but where you pick the page of the financial report that talks about changing representation on the city council and battles over funding free clinics in the city, that you've got like a really visual and compelling example. Here's a couple from our Manuscripts of the Muslim World grant. I would say picking things that have real representative value. I clearly went here for pretty. That's not always possible, but with very pithy sort of comments or justifications of why these are emblematic of the larger mass of material that are going to be digitized. It can also sort of help focus, if there's multiple partners, focus on like what really are the highlights and strengths of your different collections if you're all collaborating together. And it's sort of a nice challenge to say, like if we were to pick the highlights, what would it be and why? In this case, we've got both an example that shows art historical interest and then another example that shows textual interest, and have sort of different audiences of scholars. I think that was a nice mix for the Health of a New Nation grant of medical theses and stuff like that. Pick some Benjamin Rush notebooks talking directly about, I think maybe I picked the ones dealing with yellow fever. Can't exactly remember, but that had nice illustrations of sort of medical apparatus, and that showed the real engagement in these student notes and in professors' lecture notes with the material. And I think, I can't remember whether we did these representative examples before or after writing the main narrative, but it certainly helped me, at least thinking about our own collection of like, what do I want to say about what it is we have and why we're doing it. So I think that is a sort of helpful framework to go with. So, I think if you were reading these applications and you look at the representative samples and you look at the narrative, they should sort of go together and you can see why it meets the Amplifying Voices rubric. So I'd want to make sure the representative samples are not totally out of left field, or like the complete outliers in what you're going to digitize, but really speak to the main point of your digitization project, which is probably self-evident, but I think it can be tempting. In this case, for instance, it would have been tempting to only choose the prettiest of manuscripts for everything, even if those manuscripts were not that intellectually or textually interesting, and we made some decisions not to do that. We included some snippets of text manuscripts to show that this wasn't just a project about digitizing gold leaf. I think those decisions do matter. So that's my end slide. It's one of our camera operators working on medical dissertations during the pandemic. And with that, I realize I'm just about at 3:10. We could talk for a long time about a lot of these things. I sort of talked briefly about file formats. There's a lot of different opinions out there, and professionals in the world of digitization who have strong feelings about file formats and types. But I think getting clarity for your capacity and whether you're presenting the sort of full archival quality TIFFs and MOV files or whatever to the public versus access derivatives. These are all important questions that seem more on the technical side, but also have implications for your selection process. Same with text. Having searchable PDFs for modern material is what nearly everyone in the research world, and I think many people in the public, expect, and that's often not always what libraries deliver. So thinking carefully about your audience there, I think is another consideration. Obviously, there's another session on rights issues, but it's another fun one, and can really change the way you select manuscripts, or select items, which is one of the reasons I highlighted authorship there with the Anderson papers. And rather than keep droning on, I think I will wrap it up there and say that I'm looking forward to hearing from you, because everyone has different institutions, different experience, different kinds of material, and it would be great to get into some questions and examples and things that are relevant to you. Thanks.
Yeah, so we are prepared to take some questions. Mitch is going to field questions specific to today's focus on assessing collections for digitization. A reminder, please use the Q&A box for questions rather than the chat. Sharon, would you like to read him one first?
I sure will. The collection we have proposed has been surveyed and inventoried at the box level. We're doing a deeper dive, a deeper survey for this grant application. We also hope to receive funding to hire someone to further help with processing and selecting for digitization at the item level. Is this a good approach for these types of collections?
Well, that's a tough question. I will. The part that I can't really answer, that I kind of want to defer to the CLIR team after I finish, is the sort of programmatic or financial implications of the cost of metadata and how that fits into your overall plan and budget, all that, because that's a big thing. I think it's going to get me in trouble with some archivists. For a lot of people, a lot of use cases, a lot of researchers interacting with objects digitally often expect item level interaction. I cannot say that that's always a good thing, but I think we cannot say that it is not common, and that is not really what people expect, even if we sort of wish people followed archival practice and were okay with box level description. There are a lot of great archival reasons why item level description is like not tenable. I mean, it's just so many reasons. But I think if you're trying to make an argument about engaging specific audiences, and you can say at the box level, we don't think we can do that, and here's why. Like, we think no one's going to look through it's described as financial minutes, and it's got 1,000 images. It's a 1,000-page PDF, and we think that is just not going to do it for the purposes of this grant. I think that's justifiable. I think in other cases, you could make a very good case that the box labeled with a particular technical report on athletic achievements at whatever. So it's just like a 1,000-page report about a very specific subject. Someone's going to go to that and flip through it and skim and read, and they sort of know what it's about. It's a concrete thing. Then doing some sort of like item level, like, oh yeah, volume 1 is about this, volume 2 is about that. Kind of silly, but the budget implications and the like grant application things are significant. So I'll let the CLIR folks talk about the sort of balance of paying for metadata digitization
Yeah, I agree. There's a couple of it's hard for us to determine this one because we don't understand how large your collection is. And I don't understand, are you talking about finding funding for that now, or that funding coming from the actual grant if you get awarded? There is some monies allowed for this process of determining what's in, assessing the collections, determining, but you're gonna have to come up with that amount in your application before you get awarded. So you're making an assessment based on your understanding. We understand, just as Mitch clarified in his presentation, that sometimes it'll be a surprise. Sometimes you'll end up funding a lot more. And sometimes you may have duplicates in there that you don't even know is there. And that's expected. We want you to provide the reviewers with an estimation of what you believe to be in these collections, and that your project plan and design and budget all come together cohesively to make a estimation of how much your digitization costs are going to be. So that's where I'm confused. Is this outside funding coming from the grant? Are you writing that into your budget proposal, or is this outside of that? But you can always email us more specific questions with your specific situations to the program box at hiddencollections@clir.org, and we can help you with a more nuanced answer.
The one thing I'd add quickly, the Muslim World Grant we did, we were able to make the case for using some of that money for metadata work, because we felt that Arabic script metadata work, like we could not do the project without describing these things. But the way we sort of justified that was saying the institutions would pick up and greatly reduce their internal digitization costs to help offset this, to say, we know that this is a significant expense. So instead of charging $2 and whatever 47 cents per page, the universities are going to say we're charging $1.43, whatever it is. So that we had to make some big trade-offs to make that work possible within the limits. But I assume that's what everyone, it's trade-off.
We have one more. What advice do you have for those of us who are digitizing materials on a specific subject from across multiple collections? What should we consider when selecting materials for digitization in this circumstance?
Yeah, that's a good, the Medical Hub grant actually was sort of like that, often people were picking material relating to Philadelphia medical education, and it was like, one folder in a collection of someone's papers who, was in Philadelphia for a month and wrote about medical education. I think the big questions there are like, how are you doing the selection? Like, is there, in some cases, there's like really obvious, ways of selecting, of like, on this highly specific topic, we only have 23 things in whatever about it. So we're going to choose those 23. It's not like 10 are in, 3 are out, whatever. But making sure that if you are making tough choices, like on even things that seem specific, like we're going to digitize everything related to Vietnamese Americans in South Philadelphia. Seems highly specific. There is a ton of stuff. And it can't be, we're going to digitize everything. So it's like, okay, we're going to do everything created before 1990. Like, what is the criteria, and is it defensible with the people you're working with? Sounds confrontational. Is it like justifiable? Does it seem like a good idea? Does it make sense to say, we're going to focus on first generation only, and we can apply for another grant for other generations of people's papers or recordings? Like, just nailing down those criteria so that everyone feels, even if it's a trade-off, people don't love it, everyone's like, okay, we've made this decision. I would have preferred X, Y, or Z, but like, I know why we're doing this. This is exciting. And I think then making clear within the digitization project the provenance or source of these things. So it's not, we have this problem sometimes that people assume everything is held at Penn because it's been selected from many different places and we host it. And making sure it's clear to people, yes, this one folder on X topic came from, Mikveh Israel Synagogue downtown, and we don't own it. It's related to this collection. We digitized it. And I think there's some work we could have done to make that crystal clear. And some of the metadata. It's there, but making it clear to people. But yeah, that's a tough one.
So this one is really probably one to be fielded by us. Our audio collection was donated by the producer of the collection based on his ownership rights, and there were no performance releases collected from the musicians. Our digitization workflow will include metadata work as well as gathering releases from the musicians or their estates. This affects access outcomes. There are 200 plus reels with that number of performances. We have a webinar on this scenario. So this will probably be best addressed in our rights, ethics, and reuse session. I believe that is session 4. And that will have more to do with what you are going to be able to address from an access perspective based on what comes out of that session and their explanation of what rights you have. There's a sub-comment, we are applying for the grant to pay for this hunt for releases. That can be something that happens during the process, but it can be rather lengthy. I know that we see that this can be a rather lengthy process, so it may be something that you want to begin before being awarded, and that's definitely something that will be better addressed in session 4. Mitch, did you leave out materials that were part of the same collections to avoid copyright violations, or did you digitize and set up controlled access?
Yeah. Oh, this is a great question. In none of our CLIR grants did we leave out logical material for copyright reasons. Like in the Marian Anderson collection, we chose to just do her home recordings and do, I think, all of them, because we knew the rights were going to be okay on that. We definitely chose not to do some other audio because of that, but within those logical series, like archival series, we did them all, and just avoided an entire archival series. Controlled access is something we are currently struggling with. We have sort of controlled access for some of our media types in the reading room, but our long-term solution 2025, 26 on that for controlled access. So I think in the future, that'll be a big part of determining things and allow more flexibility instead of just saying, we'd love to digitize the series of these recordings in their entirety, but half of them are problematic. We might be able to say, yes, we'll do it because we have an access solution, as opposed to in 2017, where it's like, well, we're just going to avoid that whole series for that reason. Yeah, that's tough. This will be covered in the rights session, I'm sure, but like different risk tolerances. I mean, this is not really a clear issue, but I would say a lot of academic university libraries vary wildly on how risk tolerant they are, and then smaller organizations, community organizations also. I think there are some smaller organizations who have a pretty high tolerance for risk, knowing that they aren't a billion-dollar institution that's likely to attract the ire of a recording label. It doesn't mean there's no risk and it's not problematic, but I think within legality, there's a lot of risk. It's not a question always of strict, like, are we allowed to? It's sometimes a really tough judgment call. So I'm sure that will come up, and the kind of institution you're at and who you work with will affect that.
Also, as far as the rights, ethics, and reuse are concerned, which we'll get into that later, and with the new iteration of the program, there are some instances where that is necessary. So as long as you have a plan in the takedown due to ethical concerns, or if you have to have some fees associated with it, there is a place for that on the collections form and explaining the justification of why too. So we have another question for you. Following up on your answer to one of the last questions about level of metadata, if we are digitizing 63,000 images, we don't necessarily need to create 63,000 metadata records, one for each negative. We can possibly do one metadata record for each envelope or negative, since the envelopes contain several negatives on the same subject. Is that acceptable?
Oh, I mean, I would say the reviewers might have different, like metadata gets people going. So I don't know, whenever I'm like, yeah, that's acceptable. don't trust that. But I think largely, like, given our internal debates here, I know we have curators, people with different opinions. We've made those decisions on like the envelope, the folder, the contact sheet level, make a lot of sense. When I was just thinking of an example I saw the other day, which is from a particular event, you know, let's say a musician visiting a high school, and someone had taken 130 photos. He's a journalist, so it's a lot of photos. And, you know, we're not going to put 130 photos with individual metadata. What people want to know is, here are the 130 photos of that event on August 3rd, whatever, 1985, with this person. And you can scroll through the 130 photos that are slightly different head positions of people. And I think that makes a ton of sense.
How did you avoid feeling overwhelmed coming up with quantity estimations? LOL, did you have someone help you come up with those numbers?
Well, you can clearly see how well I did. I think I had our digitization head. I don't want to like impugn him in the blame for this estimation error, but he was really helpful in he's given his experience seeing a lot of stuff come in for digitization, could sort of eyeball a lot of stuff and say, you know, usually he's good at time estimates, like, you know, that's going to take so long or this long, and to get sort of a gut check on you know, what this is going to entail. In retrospect, this would have been a great case for some student. Again, this is at an institution that we have you know, students on work study, and not every institution has this. To have a little more sampling done, I think I would have maybe asked a student to spend a grueling hour, you know, counting pages on a couple of these. I think that would have been a good use of time. I also, yeah, I think that having more people involved, I think there was a little bit of off the cuff there that I would do differently, knowing instructively what happened, that my estimates, you know, those 2 or 3 volumes I looked at sure were 500 pages, but the average turned out to be 830. So, and I should, in CLIR's, you know, just to make it apparent that CLIR is not like, you know, seat of your pants funding everything. This was during the pandemic, and to CLIR's credit, we were in contact with them all the time. Once we hit our image limit, we said, you know what, you know, we've still got 20 volumes to go. And in our case, the other institutions in our area were still closed and had no digitization going on for COVID reasons. And we actually were able to employ our folks who were essentially alone in the building in parts of late 2020 doing this work. And everyone, there was communication with the PIs and with CLIR all along. So the estimation error wasn't just something like discovered 3 years into the project or something. It was something we realized pretty quickly, and were able to come up with a budget plan with CLIR on that needed a change order or whatever the approval was. So I shouldn't be so cavalier about it. It's an example of where estimation can matter, and also how, you know, there are solutions. It's not a disaster. There are ways to work around it.
Yeah, I wanted to say, if awarded funding, we have a grant modification process, and it does happen all the time, where they get in there and they find duplicates, or there are things that couldn't be salvaged or saved, and people want to change, do a grant modification request to change the project deliverables, which can happen. Or sometimes they save a lot of money in digitization and they want to add on to the collection, as long as it fits the same cohesive original project scope. The theme stays cohesive. You don't anticipate any additional rights ethics and reuse issues with the proposed nominated materials. This is something that is normal, that happens. There's no need to freak out. We ask for an estimation for a reason, and that your vendor and the funding and the price quantity somewhat looks reasonable as far as the digitization per item.
And that's, I think, where the margin of error matters. Like, when I'm on our digitization committee here, and when people are struggling to come up with numbers, and they're like, yeah, I think it's 130 folders, or maybe it's 126 folders. We all just like, oh, okay, that's enough. Like, we know that's like so close that it does not matter in the world of what we're doing. And even I would say 22,000 versus 49,000 images is like a big error, but it's not a million images. Like, you know, understanding where you're gonna, when the orders of magnitude really scale up, that especially if you're doing like video or audio recording, if you're getting into the, you know, 50 to 100 terabyte level, like, it does matter. Whereas at these smaller image levels, errors do matter for budget reasons, but like, you know, the orders of magnitude that are going to be safe.
So we just have a few quick reminders before we're done for today. First, we want to do a quick check-in with you again about the topic. We're going to launch another poll now. If you could take a quick moment to complete it, I'll drop the screen share. Okay. Looks like that's about complete. Thank you guys for participating and your feedback. As you work on your final application, remember there are a number of additional sessions planned over the coming months. The next one will be on March 20th and will address designing an achievable and sustainable digitization plan. You can sign up for these sessions on our Apply for an Award page, or I believe we are dropping a link in the chat.
We're so glad that you all were able to join us today, and we want to extend a huge thanks to Mitch for leading this session. As we continue our assessment of the program, we appreciate your continued feedback. So again, we've shared the links to the webinar survey as well, and we look forward to hearing how this session went, what you might like to see in future sessions, and how we might improve. Please don't hesitate to send questions to the CLIR grants team as they come up between now and the final submission deadline of May 8th. And as needed, our team will also be available to consult with Mitch on questions specific to today's topic. Thank you, and we hope to see you at another session soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.